The first bullet from Katherine Bennett's Colt revolver ricocheted off the saloon wall, missing the man who had just spit at her feet by mere inches. The second bullet found its mark in the wooden floor between his boots, sending splinters flying as the crowd scattered. "Next one goes between your eyes, mister," Katherine said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. "Unless you fancy apologizing for what you called me." The year was 1876, and Rattlesnake Creek, Arizona territory had never seen a woman quite like Katherine Bennett. With raven hair tucked beneath a worn leather hat and eyes the color of storm clouds, she had ridden into town 3 days prior, trailing dust and whispers. The saloon fell silent as the drunken cowhand staggered backward, hands raised in surrender. "Didn't mean nothin' by it, madam," he slurred, face pale beneath his sunburn. Katherine holstered her weapon with practiced ease. "Then we have no quarrel." She turned back to the bar, ignoring the stares that followed her every move. The bartender silently refilled her whiskey, giving her a wide berth. She wasn't looking for trouble, just work and a place to lay her head that wasn't beneath the stars. But trouble had a way of finding Katherine Bennett, no matter how far she rode. "That was quite a display of marksmanship," came a deep voice from behind her. Katherine didn't bother turning around, wasn't aiming to impress. Nevertheless, the man moved beside her, keeping a respectful distance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His clothes were dusty but well kept, marking him as neither desperado nor dandy. "Preston Miles," he offered, not extending his hand, sensing she wouldn't take it. "Katherine Bennett, though I don't recall asking." Preston Miles signaled the bartender. "Another for the lady and one for me." He leaned against the bar, studying her profile. "Word around town is you're looking for work." Katherine took a slow sip, considering. "Word travels fast. Small towns have big ears," Preston replied. "I run the Double M Ranch about 10 miles west. Could use someone handy with a gun and unafraid of hard work. I don't need charity, and I don't offer it." His blue eyes met hers directly. "I need someone who can handle themselves. Lost 2 hands to Apache raids last month, and cattle rustlers took 20 head last week." Katherine finished her drink. "And you think a woman can solve these problems for you?" "I think someone who can shoot like you just did might help keep what's left of my ranch intact." Preston straightened. "Pays fair. 3 meals a day in your own quarters, you interested or not?" Katherine studied him, searching for deceit or ulterior motives. She'd learned the hard way that men rarely offered honest work to women traveling alone, but something in his straightforward manner gave her pause. "I'll ride out at first light," she said finally. "No promises beyond that." Preston nodded once. "Fair enough." He left coins on the bar for their drinks and turned to leave. "First light, then." Katherine watched him go, wondering if she'd just made a grave mistake or found temporary salvation. Either way, she'd be gone before anyone could discover what or whom she was running from. The morning broke cool and clear, the desert air still crisp before the punishing heat would settle in. Katherine had packed her meager belongings before sunrise and stood outside the boarding house with her dappled mare, Willow. She traveled light, a bedroll, spare clothes, ammunition, and a worn copy of Jane Eyre that had belonged to her mother. Preston arrived precisely when he said he would, driving a wagon loaded with supplies. He nodded in greeting, his expression revealing nothing about what he thought of her being ready and waiting. "Good morning, Miss Bennett." "It's just Bennett," she corrected, mounting Willow with practiced ease. Preston didn't argue. "We'll be at the ranch by midday if we keep a steady pace." The journey was spent mostly in silence, which suited Katherine fine. Preston occasionally pointed out landmarks or mentioned ranch business, but didn't press her for conversation. The desert landscape stretched before them, painted in hues of amber, rust, and gold, dotted with saguaro cacti standing like sentinels against the vast blue sky. As promised, they crested a hill just before noon, revealing a sprawling ranch nestled in a valley. It wasn't the largest spread Katherine had ever seen, but it was well-maintained, a 2-story main house, Bunkhouse, barn, and corrals spread across the property, with cattle grazing on the surrounding land. "This is the Double M," Preston said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Been in my family for 20 years. My father built it from nothing." "It's impressive," Katherine admitted, surprising herself with the sincerity in her voice. As they approached, 3 ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse, eyeing Katherine with undisguised curiosity. "Boys," Preston called out, "this is Katherine Bennett. She'll be working with us. Show her the same respect you'd show any hand or answer to me." The statement was simple but firm, brooking no argument. The men nodded, though their expressions ranged from skepticism to amusement. The oldest of them, a weathered man with gray hair and a pronounced limp, stepped forward. "Frank Turner, foreman," he introduced himself. "Welcome to the Double M, Miss Bennett." "Just Bennett is fine," she repeated. Frank nodded. "These are Miguel Ortiz and Caleb Johnson. They don't bite unless provoked." Miguel, a young Mexican man with a friendly smile, tipped his hat. Caleb, tall and lanky with freckles across his sun-burned nose, simply nodded. "Get Miss Bennett," Preston caught himself. "Get Bennett settled in the small cabin by the creek." Used to be the old foreman's quarters before Frank moved to the bunkhouse. "Then show her around the property." "Yes, boss," Frank replied, gesturing for Katherine to follow. The cabin was modest but clean, a single room with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and a small stove. It stood apart from the other buildings, offering privacy that Katherine hadn't expected. "It ain't much," Frank said, "but it's dry when it rains and warm when it's cold." "It's more than sufficient," Katherine replied, setting her saddlebags on the bed. Frank lingered in the doorway. "Boss didn't mention what kind of work you'd be doing." Katherine turned to face him. "Does it matter?" The old foreman studied her for a moment. "Guess not. As long as you pull your weight, I always have." Frank seemed satisfied with this. "Rest up. I'll send Miguel to fetch you for supper." "Tomorrow comes early around here." Katherine spent the afternoon settling in and exploring the immediate surroundings. The cabin sat near a small creek that provided water to the ranch, shaded by cottonwood trees. After weeks on the trail, sleeping with one eye open, the peaceful setting almost made her uneasy. Peace, in her experience, rarely lasted. That evening in the main house, Katherine found herself seated at a large oak table with Preston, Frank, and the other hands. A woman in her 50s, introduced as Mrs. Hawkins, the housekeeper, served a hearty meal of beef stew, cornbread, and fresh vegetables. Conversation flowed around her talk of cattle prices, weather forecasts, and repair work needed on the north fence line. Katherine ate quietly, observing the dynamics. Preston clearly commanded respect, but there was an ease among them that spoke of fair treatment and mutual regard. "Bennett," Preston said, drawing her attention. "Frank tells me you're handy with horses. That true?" Katherine nodded. "Worked at a stable in San Francisco for 2 years. Good. We've got some Mustangs need breaking. Caleb's been trying, but they've got the better of him so far." Caleb's face reddened. "That black stallion's the devil himself." "I've handled worse," Katherine said, not as a boast but as simple fact. Preston nodded. "You'll start there tomorrow." "But tonight," he rose from the table, retrieving a bottle of whiskey and glasses. "We drink to new beginnings." Katherine accepted the glass but remained guarded. New beginnings, in her experience, often led to the same painful endings. As weeks passed, Katherine found her place at the Double M. The work was hard but honest, and she excelled at it. The Mustangs that had given Caleb so much trouble responded to her firm but patient hand. She mended fences, drove cattle, and took her turn at watch duty without complaint. The hands gradually accepted her presence, especially after she spotted rustlers attempting to steal cattle and helped drive them off with well-placed shots that wounded rather than killed. Even Frank, initially the most skeptical, developed a gruff respect for her abilities. Preston remained something of a mystery. He worked alongside his men, never asking more of them than he was willing to do himself. He was fair but reserved, revealing little about his past or personal thoughts. Katherine often felt his eyes on her when he thought she wasn't looking, but he maintained a professional distance that she appreciated. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Katherine was returning from checking the southern pasture when she spotted smoke rising from a distant hillside, too much smoke for a campfire. She spurred Willow into a gallop, racing toward the plume. As she crested the hill, she saw a small cabin engulfed in flames. An elderly man was frantically trying to lead two horses from a burning stable, while a woman threw buckets of water from a nearby stream onto the flames with little effect. Without hesitation, Katherine dismounted and ran to help, leading one panicked horse to safety while the old man struggled with the other. The heat was intense, singeing her eyebrows and hair as she worked. "Is anyone else inside?" she shouted over the roar of the fire. "No," the woman cried, "but everything we own, let it go," Katherine said firmly, pulling the woman away as the roof began to collapse. "Things can be replaced." They retreated to a safe distance, watching helplessly as the cabin was consumed. The elderly couple, who introduced themselves as Henry and Martha Wilson, had homesteaded the land for 15 years. "Raiders," Henry explained, his voice bitter. "3 men. Said this was Apache land and we had no right to it. When I argued, they torched the place." Katherine's blood ran cold. "Which way did they go?" Martha pointed west. "But please don't go after them, they'll kill you." Katherine was already mounting Willow. "You'll be safe at the Double M. It's about 2 miles northeast. Tell Preston what happened." Before they could protest further, Katherine rode in the direction the raiders had taken. The trail was fresh and easy to follow 3 horses, riding hard. She tracked them for nearly an hour as the sun began to set, finally spotting their campfire in a small canyon. From her vantage point on the ridge, she could see 3 men lounging around the fire, passing a bottle. Their conversation drifted up to her crude boasts about the fire and plans to hit another homestead to the south. Katherine considered her options. 3 against 1 weren't favorable odds, but she couldn't let them continue their destruction. She dismounted, tied Willow to a scrub oak, and checked her revolver. She was just plotting her approach when a voice spoke quietly behind her. "I wouldn't recommend charging in alone." Katherine whirled, gun raised, to find Preston crouched a few feet away, his own rifle in hand. "How the Wilsons arrived at the ranch," he explained in a whisper. "Figured you'd be fool enough to track these men alone," Katherine bristled. "I can handle myself. Never said you couldn't." But even the best gun hand can be overwhelmed by numbers. He moved beside her, peering down at the camp. 3 men, all armed, they've been terrorizing homesteaders for weeks, claiming to be acting on behalf of the Apaches. Truth is, they're just using that as cover for robbery and intimidation. "How do you know this?" Preston's jaw tightened. "Because they killed 2 of my men last month, not Apache raiders like I told you these men." Katherine studied his face in the fading light, seeing something she hadn't before: grief and guilt. Why lie about it? "Didn't know if I could trust you then." His blue eyes met hers. "I do now." The simple statement shouldn't have affected her, but Katherine felt something shift inside her chest. She looked away quickly. "So what's your plan?" Preston outlined a simple but effective strategy. They would approach from opposite sides, using the darkness as cover. On his signal, they would force the men to surrender or face consequences. "No unnecessary killing," Preston insisted. "These men need to stand trial for what they've done." Katherine nodded, though privately she thought the world might be better off without men who burned elderly couples out of their homes. They separated, moving silently through the darkness. Katherine circled to the east side of the canyon, keeping low and using the rocks for cover. When she reached her position, she could see Preston across the way, barely visible in the shadows. He raised his hand, then dropped it sharply. "Throw down your weapons," Preston's voice boomed through the canyon. "You're surrounded." The 3 men leapt to their feet, reaching for their guns. "I wouldn't," Katherine called from the opposite direction, her revolver trained on them. "Unless you're tired of living." One of the men, tall and bearded, laughed. "It's just 2 of them, boys. Take him." Gunfire erupted, bullets ricocheting off rocks. Katherine ducked behind a boulder as shots pinged around her. She waited for a pause, then rose and fired, hitting one man in the shoulder. He dropped with a howl of pain. Preston was exchanging fire with the other two, pinned down behind a narrow outcropping. Katherine saw the bearded man trying to circle behind him. "Preston, on your left," she shouted, breaking cover to get a better angle. The warning saved him but exposed her. The third raider swung his gun toward her. Katherine felt the bullet graze her side before she could fully dodge, the hot pain slicing through her ribs. She returned fire, catching the man in the leg. With two of them wounded, the fight turned. Preston charged the bearded leader, tackling him before he could reload. They grappled in the dirt, Preston finally subduing him with a solid punch to the jaw. The skirmish ended as quickly as it had begun. All three raiders were wounded but alive, disarmed and bound with their own belts. Katherine pressed a hand to her side, feeling warm blood seeping through her shirt. She tried to hide it as Preston approached, his own face bloodied from the fight. "You're hit," he said immediately, concern replacing the adrenaline in his eyes. "It's nothing. A graze." Preston ignored her protest, gently moving her hand to examine the wound. His touch was surprisingly gentle for hands so calloused from ranch work. "Needs cleaning and stitching, but you'll live." He tore a strip from his own shirt, wrapping it tightly around her ribs as a temporary bandage. "That was a damn fool thing you did, breaking cover like that," says the man who charged a loaded gun, Katherine retorted, wincing as he secured the makeshift bandage. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, understanding, respect, perhaps something more. For a moment, Katherine forgot the pain, forgot the danger they'd just faced, aware only of his proximity and the strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her wound. Preston cleared his throat, stepping back. "We need to get these men to the sheriff in town. Can you ride?" Katherine nodded, the spell broken. "I've ridden with worse." The journey back to Rattlesnake Creek was slow and uncomfortable. They reached town just before dawn, delivering the raiders to a surprised but grateful sheriff. The men were wanted for multiple robberies and 2 murders, with rewards posted for their capture. "Don't want the money," Preston said when the sheriff tried to pay them. "Just want justice for my men and the Wilsons." While Preston gave his statement, the local doctor examined Katherine's wound. 7 stitches later, she emerged from his office to find Preston waiting, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Doctor says you'll be fine but need to rest for a few days," he said, handing her a cup. Katherine accepted it gratefully. "Did he now? And when did you two discuss my condition?" "While you were getting stitched up. I pay his bills, he tells me what I need to know." Preston's expression turned serious. "You could have been killed tonight." "So could you?" Katherine sipped the strong coffee. "That's life out here." "Doesn't have to be." Preston's voice was quiet. "Not always." Before Katherine could respond, the hotel door opened and Martha Wilson rushed out, enveloping her in a careful hug that still made her wince. "Bless you both," the older woman said tearfully. "The sheriff told us you caught those terrible men." Henry joined them, shaking Preston's hand firmly. "We can never repay you." "No need," Preston assured them. "I've arranged a room for you here until we can help you rebuild. The Double M will provide whatever you need." The Wilsons' gratitude was embarrassing in its intensity. Katherine, unused to being viewed as anything but dangerous or untrustworthy, didn't know how to respond to their praise. Once the elderly couple returned inside, Preston turned to her. "We should head back. The hands will be wondering where we are." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them exhausted from the night's events. Katherine's side throbbed with each movement of her horse, but she kept pace without complaint. As they approached the Double M, Preston finally broke the silence. "Why did you go after those men alone?" "You didn't know the Wilsons. They weren't your responsibility." Katherine considered the question. "I've seen too many people hurt by those who think they can take whatever they want without consequence." "Is that why you're running?" When she stiffened, he added, "You don't have to tell me." "But I know a person running when I see one." "And what makes you such an expert?" Preston's smile was sad. Because I was running too once, from grief mainly. My wife died in childbirth 5 years ago along with our son. For a while I thought if I worked hard enough, rode far enough, I could outrun the pain. The confession, offered so plainly, caught Katherine off guard. Did it work? No. Preston looked across the landscape of his ranch. But I found purpose here, something worth staying for. Katherine remained silent, unsure how to respond to his openness. Part of her wanted to share her own story, to unburden herself of the secrets that weighed on her. But old habits and older fears kept her mouth closed. As they reached the ranch, Frank came out to meet them, relief evident on his weathered face. Was about to send out a search party, he said. The Wilsons told us what happened. Everyone's been worried sick. We're fine, Preston assured him, dismounting with a weariness that belied his words. Bennett needs rest though, caught a bullet. Frank's eyebrows shot up. Miss Katherine got shot. It's just a graze, Katherine insisted, sliding carefully from her saddle. And it's still just Bennett, Frank chuckled. Whatever you say, Miss Katherine, come on, I'll help you to your cabin. Katherine wanted to refuse, to prove she needed no assistance, but the blood loss and exhaustion were taking their toll. She allowed Frank to support her weight as they walked to her cabin, Preston following with her saddlebags. Inside, Mrs. Hawkins had already prepared fresh bandages and a basin of water. I'll tend to her, the housekeeper said firmly. You men wait outside. Once alone with Mrs. Hawkins, Katherine submitted to having her wound properly cleaned and dressed. The older woman worked efficiently, her touch professional but kind. You've had a hard life, haven't you, girl? Mrs. Hawkins asked softly as she wrapped fresh bandages around Katherine's ribs. Katherine looked up, startled by the insight. What makes you say that, Mrs. Hawkins gestured to Katherine's body where old scars marked her skin. These tell stories, some of them quite painful, I'd wager. Katherine said nothing but didn't contradict her. The boss has had his share of suffering too, Mrs. Hawkins continued. Lost his Elizabeth and their baby boy. Thought he'd never smile again. He told me, Katherine said quietly. Mrs. Hawkins looked surprised. Did he now? He doesn't speak of them to anyone. She tied off the bandage. Must trust you. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. Trust created expectations, attachment, vulnerability, all things Katherine had learned to avoid. Rest now, Mrs. Hawkins instructed, helping Katherine into a clean shirt. I'll bring food later. Left alone, Katherine lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling. The events of the past 24 hours swirled in her mind: the fire, the gunfight, Preston's unexpected confession. She'd been at the Double M for nearly 2 months now, longer than she'd stayed anywhere since fleeing San Francisco. The realization made her uneasy. Staying in one place meant putting down roots, forming connections that would be painful to sever when not if she needed to run again. Yet, for the first time in years, the urge to flee wasn't overwhelming. The Double M offered something she hadn't expected to find: not just work and shelter, but a sense of purpose, of belonging. Katherine closed her eyes, pushing away these dangerous thoughts. Belonging was a luxury she couldn't afford, not with her past always threatening to catch up with her. The following days passed in a haze of sleep and recovery. Despite her protests, Preston insisted she rest until the doctor declared her fit for work. The ranch hands took turns visiting, bringing news of daily activities and, in Miguel's case, handmade wooden chess pieces to pass the time. Preston himself came each evening after supper, often bringing a book or simply sitting in comfortable silence while she read. He never pressed her for conversation or personal revelations, seeming content just to be in her company. On the 4th evening, restless from confinement, Katherine was sitting on the small porch of her cabin when Preston arrived. The sun was setting, painting the desert in fiery hues that matched her mood. Doctor says you can return to light duties tomorrow, Preston said, settling into the chair beside her. About time. Katherine flexed her arm, testing the healing wound. I'm not built for idleness. Few of us are. Preston handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Thought you might want this back. Katherine unwrapped it to find her copy of Jane Eyre, which she'd thought lost during the skirmish with the raiders. It fell from your saddlebag, Preston explained. Found it when I went back to check the site yesterday. The thoughtful gesture touched her more than it should have. Thank you, it was my mother's. I guessed it might have sentimental value. Preston nodded toward the book. Have you read it many times, more than I can count? Katherine ran her fingers over the worn cover. My mother used to read it aloud when I was young. She loved how Jane overcame her circumstances through strength of character rather than beauty or wealth. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was. Katherine's voice softened with memory. She died when I was 16, influenza. I'm sorry. Preston's sympathy was genuine without pity. My own mother passed when I was 12. Father raised me alone after that. Is he still living? Preston shook his head. Died 2 years ago. Heart gave out while he was mending fences. Found him with the tools still in his hands. A good way to go, Katherine observed. Doing what he loved. That's what I tell myself. Preston leaned back, studying the sunset. He built this place from nothing after the war, Confederate cavalry officer turned rancher. Never thought he'd end up in Arizona territory, but he found peace here. And you, have you found peace? The question escaped before Katherine could consider its implications. Preston seemed surprised by it, but answered thoughtfully. Most days. The work helps, having purpose. He glanced at her. What about you, Katherine? What are you looking for? The use of her first name didn't escape her notice. Few people called her Katherine anymore. She'd insisted on Bennett to maintain distance, to be seen as just another hand rather than a woman. I'm not looking for anything, she said finally. Just trying to keep moving. Running, you mean. His tone held no judgment. What are you running from? Katherine stiffened. I never said I was running. You didn't have to. Preston's blue eyes held her steadily. I recognize the signs, the way you check escape routes whenever you enter a room, how you never fully unpack your saddlebags. The nightmares that wake you shouting some nights. Heat flooded Katherine's face. You've been watching me. Observing, he corrected gently. There's a difference. Katherine stood abruptly, ignoring the twinge in her side. I don't need to be observed or understood, Mr. Miles. I just need to do my job. Preston remained seated, his expression calm. Of course, forgive my presumption. He rose slowly. I'll leave you to your rest. Light duties tomorrow as the doctor ordered. He turned to go, then paused. Whatever you're running from, Katherine, you're safe here. I hope you know that. After he left, Katherine remained on the porch until the stars emerged, wrestling with emotions she'd thought long buried. Safety was an illusion she'd abandoned years ago, along with dreams of home and family. Yet Preston's words had awakened a dangerous longing for precisely those things. The next morning, Katherine returned to work, starting with gentle exercise for the recently broken Mustangs. The familiar routine was comforting, though she chafed at the restrictions on heavy lifting or riding patrol. She was brushing down the black stallion when Caleb approached, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically nervous. Miss Katherine Bennett, could I ask your advice about something? Surprised, Katherine set down the brush. What about? Caleb's freckled face reddened. Well, there's this girl in town, blacksmith's daughter. I've been sweet on her for months, but I don't know how to court her proper like. Katherine stared at him, baffled. And you're asking me because? Because you're a woman, Caleb said, as if it were obvious. And you're smart and straight-talking. Figured you'd tell me true if my ideas were foolish. The request was so unexpected that Katherine almost laughed, but Caleb's earnest expression stopped her. I'm hardly an expert on courtship, Caleb. Please? The young man looked desperate. I was thinking of bringing her wildflowers and reading her some poetry I wrote. Katherine considered this. The flowers are fine, the poetry depends on the poetry, Caleb brightened. Would you read it? Tell me if it's any good. Before Katherine could refuse, he thrust a folded paper into her hands and hurried away, calling over his shoulder. Thanks, Miss Katherine. You're a real friend, Katherine stared after him, bemused. Friend. When had she become someone people considered a friend rather than a threat or a curiosity? Later that day, Frank assigned her to help Preston repair a section of corral fence that had been damaged during the last Mustang breaking. They worked side by side, the awkwardness of the previous evening's conversation gradually dissolving in the rhythm of shared labor. "Caleb asked me for courting advice," Katherine said as they fitted a new rail into place. Preston looked up, surprise giving way to amusement. "The blacksmith's daughter, you knew about that? Everyone knows." Preston hammered a nail with practiced efficiency. "He's been mooning over Sarah Jenkins since last spring. He wanted me to review his poetry." Preston winced sympathetically. "That bad? Worse." Katherine handed him another nail. He rhymed heart with never part and compared her eyes to stars in the darkest skies. A rich laugh escaped Preston, the first true laugh Katherine had heard from him. The sound transformed his face, erasing years of care lines and making him startlingly handsome. "Poor Caleb," Preston said, still chuckling. "What did you tell him? That perhaps his sincerity would speak louder than his verses." Katherine found herself smiling too. "And to bring extra flowers to compensate." They shared another laugh, the tension between them dissipating further. As they continued working, conversation flowed more easily, covering ranch business, books they'd read, observations about the changing seasons. By mid-afternoon, the fence was repaired and Katherine found herself reluctant for the work to end. There was an ease to being with Preston that she hadn't experienced with anyone in years. "You did well today," Preston said as they gathered their tools. "How's the side feeling?" "Healing," Katherine replied. "I'll be ready for full duties by week's end." Preston nodded, then said casually, "Some of the hands are riding into town Saturday night. There's a social at the church to raise money for a new schoolhouse. Might be a chance for Caleb to present those flowers." Katherine buckled the tool belt. "Sounds like an event for respectable folks." "You're as respectable as anyone I know," Preston said firmly. "More than most." Katherine gave him a skeptical look. "A woman who carries a gun and wears men's clothing. A woman who risks her life to help strangers and works harder than men twice her size." Preston's eyes held hers. "You should come. Might do you good to remember there's more to life than work and running." Before Katherine could form a retort, he shouldered the tools and walked toward the barn, leaving her to consider his words. The idea of attending a social event surrounded by townspeople, expected to make polite conversation, and behave like a proper lady filled Katherine with dread. She'd spent years deliberately setting herself apart, cultivating a reputation that kept others at a distance. The thought of stepping back into the world of normal social interactions was both appealing and terrifying. Yet as Saturday approached, Katherine found herself considering it. Mrs. Hawkins, upon hearing of the invitation, immediately offered a dress that might need taking in a bit but would suit you beautifully. "I haven't said I'm going," Katherine protested. Mrs. Hawkins gave her a knowing look. "But you're thinking about it, which is progress enough for now." By Saturday evening, to her own surprise, Katherine found herself in Mrs. Hawkins' room, standing awkwardly as the older woman made final adjustments to a deep blue dress that had once belonged to her niece. "There," Mrs. Hawkins said, stepping back to admire her work. "Simple, but elegant. And the color brings out your eyes." Katherine hardly recognized herself in the small mirror. The dress wasn't fancy by town standards, no bustles or elaborate trimmings, but the fitted bodice and flowing skirt transformed her from ranch hand to unmistakably feminine form. Mrs. Hawkins had insisted on loosening Katherine's tightly bound hair, arranging it in a simple style that softened her features. "I look ridiculous," Katherine muttered, though secretly she was startled by the transformation. She'd forgotten what it felt like to dress as other women did, to acknowledge her femininity rather than disguise it. "You look lovely," Mrs. Hawkins corrected. "And more importantly, you look like yourself, not the self you've been pretending to be." Katherine had no response to this uncomfortably perceptive observation. She joined the others in the yard, where 2 wagons were being prepared for the journey to town. The reaction to her appearance was immediate and mortifying. Miguel let out a low whistle, quickly silenced by Frank's elbow to his ribs. Caleb, already nervous about his own plans for the evening, simply gaped, and Preston? Preston stared at her with an expression she couldn't interpret, something between wonder and revelation. He had changed too, trading his work clothes for a clean shirt, vest, and his least worn pair of jeans. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. "You look," he began, then seemed to think better of whatever he had planned to say. "I'm glad you decided to come." The ride to town was mercifully brief, filled with the men's banter and nervous energy. Katherine sat beside Mrs. Hawkins, trying to ignore the occasional glances Preston cast in her direction from the driver's seat. Rattlesnake Creek had transformed for the occasion. Lanterns hung from the porch of the newly whitewashed church, casting a warm glow over the gathered townspeople. A small band played near the refreshment tables, and several couples were already dancing in the cleared area before the church steps. Katherine hesitated at the edge of the gathering, suddenly regretting her decision. She didn't belong here among these settled, respectable people with their normal lives and uncomplicated pasts. Having second thoughts, Preston appeared beside her, offering a cup of punch. "Third and fourth ones, actually." Katherine accepted the drink, grateful for something to do with her hands. "We can leave whenever you want," he assured her, "but give it a chance first." To Katherine's surprise, the evening proved less uncomfortable than she'd feared. The townspeople were curious about her, certainly, but Preston's obvious respect and the presence of the other ranch hands gave her a kind of social protection. Several of the local women, led by Martha Wilson, made a point of including her in their conversations. Katherine observed Caleb's nervous approach to the blacksmith's daughter, smiling despite herself when the girl's face lit up at the bouquet of wildflowers. His poetry might be dreadful, but his sincerity clearly counted for something. "Your protégé seems to be doing well," Preston commented, following her gaze. "Hardly my protégé. I just told him not to recite his poetry until at least the third meeting." Preston laughed, the sound warming something inside her. "Wise advice. Would you care to dance?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't dance." "Everyone can dance. Some just do it with more grace than others." Preston extended his hand. "One dance, then we can return to the safety of the punch table if you prefer." Perhaps it was the unusual atmosphere or the unexpected pleasure of the evening so far, but Katherine found herself placing her hand in his. "One dance." Preston led her to the makeshift dance floor, where several couples were already moving to a simple waltz. He placed one hand lightly at her waist, maintaining a respectful distance between them as they began to move with the music. "See," he said softly, "you dance beautifully." "I had lessons as a child," Katherine admitted, "before everything changed." "What happened?" Preston asked, his voice gentle. Perhaps it was the music or the starlight or simply the accumulation of months of built trust, but Katherine found herself answering. "My father was a banker in San Francisco, respected, wealthy, admired. Until it was discovered he'd been embezzling from his clients for years." The words came more easily than she'd expected. "He killed himself before he could be arrested, left my mother and me with nothing but debts and disgrace." Preston's hand tightened slightly on hers, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. "My mother took in sewing to support us. I was 15, suddenly thrust from society darling to object of pity and scorn." Katherine's eyes grew distant with memory. "When Mother died a year later, I was alone. A family friend took me in a business associate of my father's. I thought he was being kind. But he wasn't," Preston guessed, his voice tight. "No," Katherine's smile was bitter. "He expected compensation for his generosity. When I refused, he became violent, said no one would believe or care about the daughter of a thief and fraud." They had stopped dancing now, standing still amid the swirling couples. Preston's eyes were dark with anger on her behalf. "You defended yourself," he said, not a question but a statement. Katherine nodded once. He didn't die, but he was badly injured. I took his gun and ran. Been running ever since, taking whatever work I could find that didn't require references or respectability. How long ago? 8 years. Katherine realized they were still standing close, his hand warm at her waist. She stepped back slightly. I've said too much. No, Preston's voice was firm. You've said exactly what needed saying, what you've carried alone for too long. The music had changed to a livelier tune, couples laughing as they spun around them. The contrast between the joyful scene and the darkness of her confession was jarring. I should get some air, Katherine said, suddenly needing space. Preston nodded, understanding in his eyes. I'll be here when you're ready to return. Katherine made her way through the crowd to the edge of town, where the desert opened up beneath a vast canopy of stars. She drew deep breaths, trying to calm the emotional turmoil her confession had unleashed. She hadn't spoken of those events to anyone in years, had locked them away in the darkest corners of her mind. Yet telling Preston had felt like lancing a wound painful but somehow necessary for healing. Miss Bennett. Katherine turned to find Martha Wilson approaching, a shawl wrapped around her thin shoulders against the night chill. Mrs. Wilson, are you enjoying the evening? Oh, very much. The older woman smiled warmly. Everyone's been so kind since the fire. Preston in particular has been a godsend, helping Henry plan the new cabin. Katherine nodded. He's a good man, the best I've known since my Henry. Martha studied her shrewdly, and he cares for you a great deal. Katherine felt heat rise to her face. We work together, that's all. Martha's smile was knowing. If you say so, dear, but I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. Like a man who's found something precious he thought lost forever. Before Katherine could formulate a response, Martha patted her arm. Don't mind an old woman's observations. But if I might offer some advice, don't let fear of the past rob you of a future, where none of us guaranteed tomorrow. With that, she turned and made her way back toward the church, leaving Katherine to contemplate her words. The ride back to the ranch that night was subdued, the men tired from dancing and, in Miguel's case, slightly drunk on smuggled whiskey. Katherine sat wrapped in a borrowed shawl, watching the moonlit landscape roll by. Preston drove the wagon in silence, occasionally glancing her way but respecting her apparent desire for quiet. It wasn't until they reached the ranch and the others had dispersed to their beds that he spoke. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said as he walked her to her cabin. "And for trusting me with your story." Katherine paused at her door. "I'm not sure why I told you. I've never told anyone before. Sometimes the right listener comes along at the right moment." Preston stood a respectful distance away, his expression thoughtful. "What you've endured would have broken many people, but instead it forged you into someone extraordinary. Or someone damaged," Katherine countered softly. "Damaged, perhaps, but not broken." Preston's voice was gentle but firm. "Never broken." In the silver moonlight, with the memory of the dance still lingering between them, Katherine felt a dangerous wall within her beginning to crumble. The urge to step toward him, to discover what might happen if she allowed herself this connection, was almost overwhelming. Instead, she opened her cabin door. "Good night, Preston." "Good night, Katherine." He tipped his hat and turned away, his tall figure soon swallowed by the darkness. Inside her cabin, Katherine removed the blue dress carefully, hanging it over the back of a chair. The evening had shifted something fundamental within her, the telling of her story, Martha's observations, the feeling of Preston's hand at her waist as they danced. For the first time in years, Katherine allowed herself to consider the possibility of stopping, of no longer running. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. The following weeks brought a subtle but undeniable change to life at the Double M. Katherine returned to her full duties, but found herself increasingly included in aspects of ranch life beyond mere work. Preston consulted her on business decisions, valuing her practical intelligence. The hands sought her advice on personal matters, perhaps encouraged by Caleb's successful courtship of Sarah Jenkins. Most significantly, The careful distance Katherine had maintained from Preston gradually diminished. Their conversations extended beyond ranch business to books, politics, dreams, and memories. She learned of his childhood in Texas, his brief time at a university back east before the call of the family ranch proved stronger than academic pursuits. He shared stories of Elizabeth, his wife, without the raw grief that had once accompanied her name. In turn, Katherine found herself revealing more of her past, her privileged upbringing, her mother's gentle wisdom, even humorous tales of her early attempts at surviving on her own after fleeing San Francisco. One evening in late autumn, they sat on the porch of the main house after the others had retired, sharing coffee laced with whiskey. The night was cool, stars brilliant overhead as a coyote called in the distance. "The Wilsons' new cabin is almost finished," Preston remarked. "Henry says they'll be moved in before the first frost. That's good." Katherine wrapped her hands around her warm cup. "They've spent too long in that hotel room." Preston nodded, then said casually, "I've been thinking of building an addition to the main house. A proper library, perhaps. Maybe another bedroom or two." Katherine glanced at him, planning to expand the household, in a manner of speaking. Preston set his cup aside, turning to face her fully. "I've been trying to find the right words for weeks now, but perhaps straightforward is best." Something in his tone made Katherine's heart beat faster. "Preston, please, let me finish before I lose my nerve." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Katherine. I think I have almost since you fired those shots in the saloon that first day. You've brought something back to life in me that I thought died with Elizabeth." Katherine sat frozen, a tumult of emotions rendering her speechless. "I'm not asking for promises," Preston continued quickly. "I know you value your independence, your freedom. I would never seek to cage you. But I want you to know that if you ever decide you're tired of running, there's a place for you here. Not just as a ranch hand, but as my partner, my wife if you'd consider it." The words hung in the night air between them. Katherine's mind raced, old fears battling against newfound longings. "I don't deserve this," she whispered finally. "This kind of love, this kind of life, after everything I've done, everything I am, that's where you're wrong," Preston interrupted gently. "You've convinced yourself you don't deserve love, happiness, peace. But you do, Katherine. You deserve mine if you want it." Tears blurred Katherine's vision, unfamiliar and unwelcome. "What if my past catches up with me? What if I bring danger to your door? Then we'll face it together." Preston reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "I'm not afraid of your past, Katherine. I only care about our future." Katherine looked down at their joined hands, then up at the man who had somehow broken through every defense she'd so carefully constructed. "I need time," she said finally. "To think." Preston nodded, squeezing her hand once before releasing it. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." That night, Katherine lay awake for hours, Preston's words echoing in her mind. Love had not been part of her plan, had not even seemed possible after everything she'd experienced. Yet here it was, offered freely by a man who knew her darkest truths and still saw something worthy. The next morning, Katherine rose before dawn and saddled Willow. She needed space to think, to sort through the conflicting emotions that kept her from sleep. She left a note for Frank explaining she was riding the north boundary and would return by evening. The desert was peaceful in the early morning light, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Katherine rode without hurry, allowing Willow to pick her way across the familiar landscape while her mind turned over Preston's proposal. For 8 years, she had defined herself by her ability to survive alone, to need no one, to leave before attachment could form. The thought of surrendering that hard-won independence, of allowing herself to need someone else, was profoundly unsettling. Yet the past months at the Double M had shown her another way of living, not in isolation, but in community. Not in constant vigilance, but in growing trust. Not running from the past, but building a future. By midday, Katherine had reached the northern boundary of the ranch, marked by a small stream that flowed year-round, feeding a grove of cottonwood trees. She dismounted, allowing Willow to drink while she sat beneath the dappled shade. "What do you think, girl?" she asked the mare, who lifted her dripping muzzle to regard her with liquid eyes. "Is it time to stop running?" The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts. Katherine instinctively reached for her gun, scanning the horizon. 3 riders were approaching from the north, not ranch hands based on their direction of travel. Katherine mounted quickly, positioning herself where the trees provided cover while allowing her a clear view. As the riders drew closer, she recognized the lead man with a jolt of shock and fear. Howard Griffith, the family friend from San Francisco, the man she'd shot while escaping. His face was older, lined with the passage of 8 years, but unmistakable. A scar ran from his right temple to his jaw, the mark of her bullet that had grazed rather than killed him. Katherine's first instinct was to flee, to ride hard for the ranch and gather her belongings before Griffith could reach her. But that would lead him directly to the Double M, to Preston and the others who had become important to her. Instead, she urged Willow forward into the open, her gun ready but not drawn. Better to confront him here alone than endanger the ranch. Griffith reined in his horse, surprise and then cruel satisfaction spreading across his features. "Katherine Bennett," he called, his voice just as she remembered from her nightmares. "Or should I say Katherine Harrington, daughter of the disgraced Richard Harrington, Griffith." Katherine kept her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "You're a long way from San Francisco." "A journey 8 years in the making." Griffith signaled for his companions to spread out, flanking her. "Do you know how long it took me to recover from what you did? How much it cost to keep the truth of my injuries quiet? Not enough, apparently." Katherine assessed the other men hired guns by the look of them, not particularly skilled but dangerous nonetheless. "I've tracked you across 4 states, Griffith continued. "Every time I got close, you'd vanish again, but everyone makes mistakes eventually. Yours was staying in one place too long. What do you want, Griffith?" His smile was cold. "Justice, my dear, repayment for my suffering, my expenses, my damaged reputation. I have nothing to give you." "Oh, I think you do." Griffith's eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "You've grown into quite the woman, Katherine, still just as valuable to me as you were at 16, perhaps more so." Katherine's grip tightened on her reins. "I'll die before I go anywhere with you." "That can be arranged too." Griffith's smile vanished. "But I'd prefer you alive." "The choice is yours, come peacefully, or these men will bring you by force. Either way, you're returning to San Francisco to face charges for your attack on me." "There won't be charges," Katherine said with certainty. "Not when I tell what really happened. What you tried to do to a grieving 16-year-old girl. Your word against mine, the daughter of a thief against a respected businessman." Griffith shrugged. "Who do you think society will believe?" He was right, and they both knew it. Even after 8 years, his position and wealth would shield him from any accusations she might make. Katherine's mind raced, calculating distances, angles, odds. 3 against 1 were poor odds, but she'd faced worse and survived. "I need a moment to consider," she said, playing for time. Griffith nodded magnanimously. "Take all the time you need. We have the entire day." Katherine pretended to deliberate while subtly shifting her position, getting the sun behind her to disadvantage her opponents. If she could disable Griffith first, the hired guns might be less committed to the fight. She was preparing to make her move when a gunshot cracked through the air, the bullet striking the ground near Griffith's horse, causing it to rear in panic. "That's far enough," came Preston's voice from behind her. Katherine whirled to see Preston emerging from the trees, rifle raised, with Frank and Miguel flanking him, similarly armed. "This doesn't concern you," Griffith snarled, struggling to control his frightened horse. "Anything that concerns Miss Bennett concerns me," Preston replied, his voice deadly calm as he moved to Katherine's side. "Especially when it involves 3 armed men threatening her on my land." Relief and fear warred within Katherine. "Preston, you shouldn't be here. This is my problem." "Not anymore," Preston said simply, his eyes never leaving Griffith. Now it's our problem. Frank and Miguel had positioned themselves strategically, creating a protective formation around Katherine. The odds had shifted dramatically. "Who are these men, Katherine?" Preston asked, though his rifle remained trained on Griffith. Briefly, Katherine explained Griffith's identity and his threats. With each word, Preston's expression hardened, his normally gentle eyes turning to ice. "Is that so?" Preston addressed Griffith directly. "You've come to force a woman to return with you against her will based on a grudge from 8 years ago." "This woman shot me and left me for dead," Griffith countered. "She's a criminal." "She was a child defending herself from a predator," Preston corrected, his voice dangerous. "And now she's under my protection," Griffith sneered. "Your protection means nothing. I have the law on my side." "Not in Arizona territory, you don't." Frank spoke up, his weathered face contemptuous. "Out here, we take a dim view of men who prey on young girls, no matter how wealthy they claim to be. And we take care of our own," Miguel added, his usually cheerful expression replaced by cold determination. Griffith glanced between the armed men, clearly reassessing his position. "This isn't over. I'll return with the sheriff." "By all means," Preston replied. "Sheriff Evans is a personal friend. I'm sure he'd be very interested to hear about a San Francisco businessman tracking a woman across state lines with hired guns. Especially when that woman has been a respected member of our community for months." Katherine watched the calculation in Griffith's eyes. He had expected to find her alone and vulnerable, as she had been for years. Instead, he found her surrounded by people willing to fight for her. "You're making a mistake," Griffith said finally. "This woman isn't worth your trouble." "That's where you're wrong," Preston replied, his voice softening as he glanced briefly at Katherine. "She's worth everything." Something in his tone made Griffith look between them, understanding dawning. "I see. Well, enjoy her while you can, Cowboy. Damaged goods don't make for lasting relationships." Preston's finger tightened on the trigger, but Katherine placed a hand on his arm. "He's not worth it," she said quietly. "Not worth becoming a killer." After a tense moment, Preston nodded. "You have until sundown to be off Double M land," he told Griffith. "After that, we consider you trespassers and deal with you accordingly." Griffith held Preston's gaze for a long moment, then abruptly wheeled his horse around. "This isn't finished," he called over his shoulder as he and his men rode away. The tension held until the riders were distant specks on the horizon. Only then did Katherine release the breath she'd been holding, her legs suddenly weak with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. "How did you find me?" she asked, turning to Preston. "You always ride the north boundary clockwise," he explained. "When Frank mentioned you'd gone out alone, I had a feeling something wasn't right. Call it instinct or love," Frank muttered, not quite under his breath. Katherine looked between the 3 men who had come to her aid without hesitation. "Thank you, all of you." "De nada," Miguel said with a smile, the tension broken. "No one threatens our Miss Katherine." "He'll be back," Katherine said soberly. "Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually." "Griffith doesn't give up easily." "Neither do we," Preston assured her, "but we should return to the ranch, safety in numbers until we're sure he's left the territory." The ride back was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Katherine felt a strange mix of emotions: residual fear from the confrontation, gratitude for the intervention, and an unexpected sense of belonging. These men had risked themselves for her without question. They had claimed her as one of their own. As they approached the ranch, Preston dropped back to ride beside her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Katherine looked at him in surprise. "For what?" "For pushing you last night, for making you feel pressured when you needed time." His expression was troubled. "I never meant to complicate your life further." "You didn't," Katherine assured him. "Griffith would have found me eventually, regardless." Preston nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "What will you do now?" The question was loaded with unspoken meaning. Would she run again, as she always had? Return to the solitary existence that had kept her safe but lonely for 8 years? Katherine considered the ranch spread before them the place that had somehow become home when she wasn't looking. She thought of Mrs. Hawkins' maternal concern, of Frank's gruff affection, of Miguel and Caleb's brotherly teasing, and of Preston, who had offered not just his heart but his complete acceptance of who and what she was. "I don't know," she admitted. "Running has been my only strategy for so long." "You have other options now," Preston said gently. "Whatever you decide, I'll support it, even if—" He paused, visibly steeling himself, "even if it means helping you leave safely." The thought of leaving the Double M, of leaving Preston, created a physical ache in Katherine's chest. Somehow, without her noticing, this place and these people had become essential to her. The realization was both frightening and exhilarating. "I need to think," she said as they reached the ranch yard. Preston nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take all the time you need." That evening, Katherine sat alone on her cabin porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson. The confrontation with Griffith had forced a reckoning she'd been avoiding for months, perhaps years. She had spent so long running, so long convincing herself she was unworthy of connection, that the possibility of staying, of building a life, seemed almost unimaginable. Yet the thought of leaving filled her with a sense of loss she couldn't ignore. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Katherine opened it to find Mrs. Hawkins holding a covered tray. "Thought you might prefer to eat alone tonight," the housekeeper said, setting the tray on the small table. "After all the excitement, thank you." Katherine was genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness. Mrs. Hawkins hesitated, then said, "The boss told us what happened, about that man from San Francisco." Katherine tensed, waiting for judgment or pity. Instead, Mrs. Hawkins said firmly, "If that snake shows his face here again, he'll get more than he bargained for. I still have my late husband's shotgun, and I know how to use it." The fierce protectiveness from the normally proper housekeeper startled a laugh from Katherine. "I believe you would." "Of course I would." Mrs. Hawkins patted Katherine's arm. "You're family now, whether you know it or not." Family. The word hung in the air after the housekeeper left, resonating with meaning. Family wasn't something Katherine had allowed herself to consider for a very long time. As night fell, Katherine made her decision. She had spent 8 years letting Howard Griffith dictate her life through fear. She would not give him one day more. The next morning, Katherine rose early and walked to the main house. Preston was already at the corral discussing the day's work with Frank. He straightened when he saw her approaching, hope and apprehension warring in his expression. "Good morning, Katherine. I'd like to speak with you," she said, "privately." Preston nodded, excusing himself from Frank, who made a poor attempt at hiding his knowing smile. They walked together to the shade of a large oak tree that stood near the house, far enough from the daily activities for privacy. "I've been thinking about what you said," Katherine began, finding the words harder than she'd anticipated. "About deserving love." Preston waited, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "For years, I've defined myself by what happened with Griffith, by the fear, the shame, the belief that I was somehow tainted by it." Katherine met his eyes directly. "I convinced myself I didn't deserve a normal life, certainly not love." "Katherine," she held up a hand. "Please, let me finish." "Yesterday, when Griffith found me, my first instinct was to run. It's all I've known for so long." Katherine took a deep breath. "But then you appeared, and Frank and Miguel. You all risked yourselves for me without hesitation, and I realized something." Preston stood very still, barely breathing. "I realized that while I've been telling myself I don't deserve love, I've found it anyway. Here, with you, with everyone at the Double M." Katherine's voice faltered slightly. "And I don't want to run anymore." The hope in Preston's eyes was almost painful to witness. "What are you saying, Katherine?" "I'm saying yes." She stepped closer to him. "Yes to staying, yes to building a life here, yes to your proposal if it still stands." For a moment, Preston seemed frozen in disbelief. Then he closed the distance between them, his hands gently framing her face as if she were made of precious glass. "It stands," he whispered. "It will always stand." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer both. When they parted, Katherine saw her own wonder reflected in Preston's eyes. "I can't promise I won't be afraid sometimes," she admitted. "Or that the past won't haunt me, but I want to face it with you if you'll have me." Preston's smile was radiant. "I'll have you any way you'll allow, Katherine Bennett, fears, ghosts, and all." As word spread through the ranch, celebrations erupted spontaneously. Mrs. Hawkins wept openly, declaring she'd always known they were meant for each other. Frank pretended the dust had gotten in his eyes. Miguel organized an impromptu feast, while Caleb rode to town to spread the news and invite the Wilsons and his beloved Sarah. By evening, the main house was filled with laughter and music, the ranch hands having procured a fiddle and harmonica from somewhere. Katherine found herself surrounded by genuine joy and acceptance, overwhelmed by the realization that these people had become her family when she wasn't looking. Preston stayed close by her side, occasionally squeezing her hand as if to reassure himself she was real and staying. During a quiet moment, he led her outside to the porch away from the cheerful chaos. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. Katherine considered the question seriously. "Happy feels too small a word," she answered finally. "I feel whole, for the first time in longer than I can remember." Preston's smile was tender as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "That's all I want, for you to feel whole, safe, valued." "What about Griffith?" The question had to be asked, though she hated to darken the moment. "We'll face him if necessary," Preston said firmly. "But I've sent Miguel to alert Sheriff Evans about the situation." Between the sheriff's official interest and Griffith's awareness that you're no longer alone and vulnerable, I believe he'll move on to easier targets. Katherine nodded, hoping he was right. "And if he doesn't?" "Then we defend what's ours." Preston's voice was resolute. "This is your home now, Katherine. No one will drive you from it. Home." Another word that had lost meaning during her years of running, now reclaimed and filled with new significance. They were married 3 weeks later in the Rattlesnake Creek Church, the same building where they had danced that fateful night. Katherine wore the blue dress, now altered by Mrs. Hawkins into a suitable wedding gown with the addition of lace at the collar and cuffs. The entire town turned out for the occasion, along with ranchers from neighboring properties. The Wilsons acted as witnesses, Martha weeping joyfully throughout the ceremony. Caleb, with Sarah on his arm, beamed as if personally responsible for the match. Even the sheriff attended, assuring Katherine that Howard Griffith had been spotted crossing into New Mexico territory, apparently having decided to pursue easier prey. As Preston slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Katherine felt the last of her walls crumble. The woman who had once fired warning shots in a saloon, who had survived by keeping everyone at a distance, who had convinced herself she didn't deserve love, now stood openly accepting it before all. "I, Preston, take you, Katherine, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he vowed, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." When it was her turn, Katherine's voice wavered only slightly. "I, Katherine, take you, Preston, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Preston's kiss was a promise sealed before all who mattered to them. The celebration afterwards spread from the church to the saloon to the street itself, becoming one of the largest parties Rattlesnake Creek had seen in years. Katherine found herself passed from one well-wisher to another, accepted not as an outsider but as a cherished member of the community. As the sun began to set, Preston found her amidst the revelry, offering his hand. "May I steal my wife away?" he asked with a smile that was for her alone. They rode back to the Double M as the stars emerged, the ranch hands tactfully remaining in town to continue the celebrations. The main house stood welcoming in the twilight, lanterns already lit in anticipation of their return. Preston helped Katherine from her horse, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Miles," he said softly as he set her down in the entryway. Katherine looked around the house that was now truly hers at the man who had claimed her heart when she thought it beyond repair, and felt a sense of peace she had never known possible. "I love you," she said, the words new but right on her lips. Preston's smile was luminous. "And I love you. Always will." As he drew her into his arms, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just a home but a future. A future built not in spite of her past, but inclusive of it every scar, every fear, every hard-won strength. She had spent years believing she didn't deserve love, until a cowboy had shown her she deserved his. And in accepting that love, she had finally found the courage to offer her own in return. Spring came to the Double M Ranch with a riot of desert wildflowers and the birth of new calves. Katherine, now 5 months pregnant with their first child, sat on the porch of the main house, watching Preston work with a young horse in the corral. The past year had brought changes she could never have imagined when she first rode into Rattlesnake Creek. The addition to the house had been completed a library filled with books Preston ordered from as far away as Boston, and a nursery painted in soft yellows and greens, awaiting its occupant. Word had reached them through business contacts that Howard Griffith had finally met justice, though not from the law. He had attempted to force himself on the daughter of a New Mexico cattle baron and found himself on the wrong end of a protective father's gun. Katherine had felt not joy at the news, but a quiet relief, the final shadow lifting from her life. Preston finished his session with the horse and walked toward the house, his smile widening as he saw her. Even now, after months of marriage, the sight of him still caused her heart to quicken. "How are my 2 favorite people today?" he asked, leaning down to kiss her before placing a gentle hand on her rounded belly. "Active," Katherine replied with a laugh as the baby kicked against his palm. "Your son or daughter has apparently decided to take up dancing." "Good strong Miles blood," Preston said proudly. "Though with a mother like you I'd expect nothing less than extraordinary." Katherine covered his hand with hers. "I never thought I'd have this," she admitted softly. "A home, a husband, a child on the way. For so long I convinced myself such things weren't meant for women like me. And now," Preston sat beside her, drawing her close. Katherine rested her head against his shoulder, watching as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting their land in gold. "Now I know better," she said simply. "Now I know what I deserve." Preston's arms tightened around her. "And what is that, Mrs. Miles?" Katherine smiled, feeling the baby move within her, feeling the strength of Preston's love surrounding her, feeling the peace that had finally, permanently settled in her soul. "Everything," she answered. "I deserve everything, and so much more." As the sun set over the Double M, Katherine Bennett, Miles' once a frightened girl, once a solitary wanderer, now a beloved wife, soon to be mother, and woman fully come into her own, watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky and gave thanks for the journey that had brought her home.